G'day guys, how are you going? Today I'm going to be making a video that's a bit different because the weather has been absolutely horrible these last few days and I don't really want to go outside and make a video, but there will be two really cool cars coming up on the channel really soon. So if you haven't subscribed, which you probably haven't because I've only got 55 subscribers, then please go ahead and subscribe. You will not regret it, and if you do, you can always unsubscribe, so there's always that. So today is going to be a bit different because I'm going to be talking to you about the topic of the Holden Commodore, which is the quintessential Australian car and why it has failed so miserably these last few years. So in 2017, the last Holden Commodore VF2, Australian built Holden Commodore, rolled off the factory floor. As I said, the Holden Commodore was the Australian car. There was, of course, the Ford Falcon, which I owned, but the Holden Commodore is arguably even more Australian than the Ford Falcon. They were full-size cars offered in a rear-wheel drive setup with a V8 option for just under 50,000 Australian dollars, which is around about 34,000 US dollars, which in Australian dollars is really cheap for a car, especially considering you could get this in a manual. So you had a manual rear-wheel drive V8 behemoth of a car. But people stopped buying it. And the reason is pretty simple. I mean, it's the same around the rest of the world. No one is buying sedans anymore. People are moving towards SUVs. Of course, some people are buying sedans, but really they're in the minority of people now. Everyone wants just an SUV because it's seen as a better value proposition, even though in a lot of cases, it's not. Add to that the fact that most people don't care about a rear-wheel drive car with a V8 manual. They just don't care because it's more hassle than usually they want. They don't care about the speed and things like that. They just want something that can get them from point A to point B with all the latest safety and tech. And so they really don't care whether it's got a big V8 in it or a 4-cylinder turbo. They just couldn't care less. And then there's also the fact that Australian wages are high, which is not a bad thing, but producing an Australian vehicle in Australia is just too expensive nowadays. And so that is why Holden stopped producing the Commodore in Australia. It just wasn't economically viable anymore, which makes sense. They're a for-profit company, and as sad as it is to lose the Holden Commodore, the real issue is that people weren't buying it. Well, they weren't buying it anyway to make it valuable enough for them to keep making it. But this left GM, General Motors, the owner of Holden, with a huge dilemma. They didn't just want to give up the Holden Commodore namesake. It was worth way too much to lose out on the Holden Commodore, a car that's been produced in Australia since 1978. It was a huge brand name, probably worth in the billions, so giving it up is not really a great option. But they also had to stop producing the Holden Commodore because it just wasn't viable anymore. So they brought over what they thought was a good alternative, the Opel Insignia. And this is really where the issues started. Now, Holden say that they kept the Holden Commodore name because of consumer preference. And while I'm sure that that is partially true, and yes, people did not want to lose the Holden Commodore name, I don't think people really wanted it to be replaced by something that isn't a Holden Commodore. It is a completely different car. Dimensionally, it's very similar, but internally, it is completely different. The biggest difference does come from the drivetrain. So the new ZB Holden Commodore, or this one right here, the Holden Opel Commodore Insignia, whatever you want to call it, is powered standard by a 4-cylinder turbocharged unit, which is driven by the front wheels through a front-wheel drive transmission, whereas the outgoing Holden Commodore for the last 30 years has been powered as a rear-wheel drive with a 6-cylinder engine. So very different layout, very, very different setup. And most controversially, this is the first Holden Commodore to not be optioned with a V8 engine. And this V8 engine has been huge. The outgoing VF2 Commodore, that had a 304 kilowatt engine with just under 600 newton meters of torque. This was a powerful, powerful car. And as I said, you could get it for less than 50,000 Australian dollars or 34,000 US dollars, which is really cheap. And in the US, it was sold as the Chevy SS. Now, this is of course not to say that the Holden Commodore is a bad car. In fact, it's actually quite a good full-size sedan. It's packed with latest technology. You can get some pretty powerful options with a 6-cylinder engine driven to all-wheel drive, so it's sub 6 seconds, 0 to 100 or 0 to 60. but it's not a Holden Commodore. And don't just take my word for it, look at the sales figures. In 2017, the Holden Commodore VF2, the outgoing Holden Commodore, sold just under 24,000 units. But then if you have a look at the sales of 2018 for the Holden Commodore ZB, that sold under 7,000 units. That's a 72% drop in sales of the Holden Commodore. Australians aren't buying the fact that this is a Holden Commodore. In fact, so badly was the Holden Commodore not selling that Holden actually ceased the production of the Holden Commodore in the Opel factory from October 2018 to January 2019, which is the first time it's done that in a very, very long time. They were producing more Holden Commodores than they were selling Holden Commodores, and so they had to stop. Sadly enough, the Holden ZB Commodore, or the Opel Insignia, or the Vauxhall Insignia, has had the lowest resale value of any new car in Australia in 2018. If you have a look at this Holden Commodore LT, it sold for just over 35,000 Australian dollars new, has slightly higher kilometers than usual for a car its age, and yet is selling for less than 22,000 Australian dollars. This is a huge price drop, and honestly, if you're looking for a bargain car with the latest safety, the latest tech, then you're better going off with a Opel, the Holden Commodore, than you are with pretty much any other new car on the market if you're in the market for a full-size sedan. It's a pretty good value proposition for us and really sad for Holden. So clearly the car is not doing so hot, but there is some hope. GM have been spotted driving the Cadillac CT5, which is rumored to have a twin-turbo V8 engine producing just under 400 kilowatts of power. It'll be an absolute monster if that car is released in Australia, and is actually about the exact same size as the outgoing Holden Commodore VF2. So it'll be a really good replacement for what the V8 Commodore would have been, but it is still not a Holden Commodore, and I sincerely hope they don't try and market it as like a Holden Commodore SS, because really it isn't what a Holden Commodore SS is. It isn't an Australian-built V8 car, it is an American-built car, but it would be a great replacement for it. But you know what? At least it shares more in common than with the Opel Insignia, because it has a rear-wheel drive as well. So it'll be a much better car than the Opel Insignia if they do decide to keep the Holden Commodore brand. I personally am hoping for one day they'll rebuild an Australian car. I doubt it will ever happen because of wages being way too high, but I hope that it will happen at some point and we can rebrand the Commodore and have the Holden Commodore back in Australia once again, just like the Ford Falcon. But let me know what you guys think. I'd love to hear your comments. What do you think about the Holden Commodore being replaced by the Opel Insignia? Do you think that it is a real Holden Commodore, or is it just another car that's really not? It's just being put under that name, put under a guise, and it's not really a Holden Commodore. And don't forget to subscribe. I'd love to see you guys around. I've only got 55 of you guys, and I know many more of you are watching, so hit that subscribe button, notification bell if you like these videos, like or dislike, depending on what you want, and I'll see you next time.